it's worth underscoring. I see in the media banners that say, war expanding or war spread. It's actually the opposite. It's actually quite contained, and more of those countries are coming on side, recognizing that you can't live under a conventional umbrella with nuclear ambitions with a radical regime like that. Again, properly scoping the objectives in the process. For example, today will be yet again our most intense day of strikes inside Iran. The most fighters, the most bombers, the most strikes. Intelligence more refined and better than ever.
If that statement sounded confusing, that's because it is. Because according to the Pentagon, the war in Iran is somehow both contained and expanding at the same time. Contained, but also escalating. Calming down, but also preparing for the largest day of strikes yet. And that contradiction is now at the center of a growing crisis inside the Trump administration. Because while the White House is struggling to explain what exactly is happening in Iran, a completely different scandal has just exploded inside the Pentagon. A spending scandal. One involving millions of dollars in luxury food purchases, electronics, and even a nearly $100,000 grand piano, all paid for with taxpayer money. And the worst part? This spending spree happened just months before the administration asked Congress for another $50 billion for the war effort. Which means the same department now asking for emergency funding may have just been caught blowing through billions. And if Congress decides it can't trust the Pentagon with more money, this scandal could suddenly become a very serious problem for Donald Trump's war strategy. So let's walk through what actually happened here. Because once you see the details of this spending spree, you start to understand why this story is spreading across Washington.
I just came from a 2-hour closed-door classified briefing on the war. It just confirmed to me it's totally incoherent. We are not going to be able to achieve any of our stated objectives. But I mention it because it's another closed-door briefing. We have still not yet heard a full explanation as to why this is necessary. We still have had no hearings in front of Congress that the public can see, and I think that's pretty simple. Because if the president did what the Constitution says, come to Congress to get authorization for this war, he wouldn't get it. The American people would demand that their member of Congress, their senator, whether they be a Republican or Democrat, vote no, because this is a disaster of epic proportion.
That was Senator Chris Murphy after attending one of the administration's classified briefings on the war in Iran, and his reaction was blunt. The strategy, according to Murphy, is incoherent. Now, that's not the kind of word you usually hear after a military briefing. Normally, lawmakers walk out saying the situation is complicated, or evolving, or sensitive. But incoherent means something very different. It means the explanation simply doesn't make sense, and Murphy wasn't the only one raising concerns. Because lawmakers on Capitol Hill are now saying they still haven't received a clear public explanation for why this war started in the first place. No public hearings, no detailed briefings for the American people, and that absence is raising serious questions. Because historically, when the United States goes to war, there's usually a clear moment when the administration explains its objectives. But so far, that moment hasn't happened. Instead, what we're seeing are contradictory statements that seem to change from day to day. And that confusion only deepened after another top senator spoke out.
Trump's explanation about his war, as I say, grows more confusing, more contradictory every hour almost. Yesterday, Trump casually claimed, "I think the war is very complete," pretty much. But this morning, Hegseth stood before the cameras and announced that today will be the most intense day of strikes yet, involving, quote, "the most fighters, the most bombers, the most strikes," unquote. Which is it? Is the war ending soon, or are we on the brink of the worst fighting yet? Donald Trump's a liar. He claims that Iranian Tomahawk missiles were responsible for the bombing of an all girls school that unfortunately killed 170 people, many of them children. Iran doesn't have Tomahawk missiles. The claim is beyond asinine, it's just an outright lie. The president can't just talk off the top of his head on something as formidable as this. The President of the United States is spreading blatant lies about a war he started.
That was Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and his criticism highlights the central contradiction. One message says the war is nearly finished. Another message says the biggest attacks are still coming. Both cannot be true. And when government officials deliver completely different versions of reality, confidence starts to collapse. But as serious as that communication problem is, it turns out the Pentagon may be dealing with something even more damaging. Because while all of these confusing statements were being made publicly, investigators were quietly digging through the Pentagon's budget records. And what they found raised a very uncomfortable question. What exactly has the Defense Department been spending its money on? Every year, the federal government operates on a budget cycle. And at the end of that cycle, something unusual happens. If agencies don't spend the money they were allocated, they lose it. It goes back to Congress, which means departments often rush to spend remaining funds before the deadline. It's known in Washington as the use it or lose it rule. But according to a government watchdog group called Open the Books, the Pentagon's spending last September went far beyond the usual rush. In fact, investigators say the department spent nearly $93 billion in the final weeks of the fiscal year. $93 billion. That's not a routine spending push. That's a massive surge. And when analysts began reviewing the purchases, some of the items looked unusual. For example, more than $2 million on king crab, nearly $7 million on lobster tails, over $15 million worth of ribeye steaks. There was also $1 million spent on salmon, more than $139,000 on donuts, and even $124,000 on ice cream machines. Now, large organizations do buy food for military bases. That's normal. But critics say the scale of these purchases raises serious questions, especially when they all happened during a single month. But the food spending wasn't the only thing investigators noticed, because the same records also show millions of dollars spent on consumer electronics, Apple devices, Samsung equipment, tablets, phones, all purchased in large quantities during that same last-minute spending window. But the most surprising purchase on the list? A nearly $100,000 Steinway grand piano. Yes, a grand piano. Purchased for the residence of a senior Air Force official. Now again, individually any one of these purchases might have an explanation, but taken together, they paint a picture of a department rushing to burn through leftover money before the deadline. And that picture becomes much more politically dangerous when you consider what happened next. Because just months after this spending spree, the Trump administration went to Congress with a new request, an additional $50 billion for military operations connected to the war in Iran. Supporters of the plan say the funding is essential. They argue it will strengthen American military capabilities and help defeat hostile regimes. One of the loudest voices making that argument is Senator Lindsey Graham.
I want to get your take on all of this. $1 billion a day. Oil prices up 27% in a week. You've got the president wanting a $1.5 trillion defense budget in 27. The idea that the Pentagon is about to come to you for $50 billion on these strikes to Iran. How are you going to answer?
Best money ever spent. Was it worth to America to take down a religious regime who's trying to build a nuclear weapon to deliver to America? That's a really good investment. They're going to fall. It's not if the regime falls, it's a matter of when.
But critics say the Pentagon spending scandal changes everything, because now lawmakers are asking a simple question. If the Defense Department had billions of dollars left in its budget last year, why didn't it use that money to prepare for the conflict? Why buy luxury food instead of ammunition? Why buy electronics instead of weapons systems? Why buy a grand piano instead of military equipment? Those questions are now hanging over the entire funding debate in Washington. And in politics, perception matters. If lawmakers start to believe taxpayer money is being wasted, they become much less willing to approve new funding. Which means the scandal surrounding Pete Hegseth could suddenly become a major obstacle for the administration. Now here's why this situation is particularly dangerous for Donald Trump. Trump has long argued that he runs government like a business. Efficient, disciplined, focused on eliminating waste. But stories like this create the exact opposite image. Instead of efficiency, they suggest chaos. Instead of discipline, they suggest mismanagement. And if this scandal grows, It could force the White House into an uncomfortable position, defend the Pentagon's spending decisions, or distance itself from the man who approved them. Neither option is easy, especially in the middle of a war. Because if Congress loses confidence in the Pentagon's leadership, the consequences could go far beyond a single embarrassing headline.
They could determine whether the administration gets the funding it needs to continue its military strategy. And right now, that fight is just beginning.